Have you ever had one of those moments? A moment that was supposed to be quiet, a little island of peace in the middle of your crazy life, only to have someone try to take it from you? Not because they needed it, but because they simply decided they were more important. This is a story about one of those moments, but it's also a story about a quiet man and the day he decided he had had enough. Our story begins in the humming, busy world of Chicago O'Hare Airport, a river of people flowing to different gates, different lives. And right there in the middle of it all was a man named Magnus Thorne. If you saw him, you might not look twice. He wasn't loud. He didn't dress to impress. At 47, Magnus had a kind of quiet confidence that didn't need to shout. He wore a simple, well-fitting charcoal blazer over a black t-shirt, dark jeans, Ousted, and boots that had seen a few miles but were still cared for. He carried a single, sleek carry-on and a leather briefcase that was worn soft in places, like a favorite book. Magnus had just come from Denver, where he'd closed the biggest deal of his year. He was the founder and CEO of a company called Ether Solutions, but you'd never know it. He traveled alone, no assistance, no fuss. He was heading home to Seattle, and for him, this flight wasn't just a trip. It was a breath, a chance to finally sit down, to look out the window and to just be, to let the high of his success settle into a warm, quiet glow inside him. He walked down the jet bridge and onto the Global Skyways plane. He nodded to the flight attendant, a small, polite smile on his face, and made his way to seat 2A. First class. Now for Magnus, 2A wasn't just about the extra leg room or the free drink. It was his spot. It was a ritual. In a life where every day was different, new problems, new cities, new pressures, this seat was a constant. It was a small promise he kept to himself, a little piece of order. As he settled into the soft leather, he let out a slow breath. He tucked his briefcase carefully under the seat in front of him and looked out the small window at the ground crew below. Everything was right. Everything was calm. But you know how life is. Just when you get comfortable, that's when the tide changes. The plane was almost full. The familiar sounds of bags being stowed and seatbelts clicking filled the cabin. Magnus had just closed his eyes for a second when he heard a gentle clearing of a throat. He looked up. A flight attendant stood in the aisle. She was petite, with a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. There was a tightness in her face. "Mr. Thorne?" she began, her voice low. "I'm so sorry, but we're going to need you to switch seats for a moment. There's been a little mix-up." Magnus blinked. He was genuinely confused. He'd checked in online. He'd scanned his boarding pass. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice even. "This is my seat. It's right here on my ticket." Her smile tightened. "I understand, sir, but another passenger was supposed to have this seat reserved. It would really make things easier for us if you could just move." "Reserved?" Magnus's mind ticked over. "That's not how it works. You buy a ticket for a seat. There's no reserving over a paid passenger." Something felt off. He followed her subtle glance over her shoulder toward the galley area. And that's when he saw him. A young man, probably in his late 20s, tall, sandy-haired, wearing a designer polo shirt and sunglasses pushed up on his head. He was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, with a look on his face, a look of casual expectation, a slight smirk that said, "This will all be sorted out soon." A cold little stone dropped into Magnus's stomach. This wasn't a mix-up. This was a power play. He looked back at the flight attendant. "And where would you like me to go, Peter?" he asked, his tone still polite. "Seat 4B. It's still in first class, just a few rows back." A few rows back. It sounded so small. But it wasn't about the few rows. It was about the principle. It was about being told to get up, to give up something that was rightfully his, for no other reason than to make a smirking stranger feel more important. He took a slow, quiet breath. "I appreciate that," he said, "but I booked this seat weeks ago. I'm going to stay right here." For a moment, the attendant just stared at him, as if surprised he hadn't immediately complied. Then she gave a tight little nod and retreated. The air in the cabin felt different now, thicker. A few passengers nearby had overheard. An older woman across the aisle with sharp, intelligent eyes and silver hair caught Magnus's gaze. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod of solidarity. But it wasn't over. You could feel it. The calm was a lie. Sure enough, a few minutes later the footsteps returned. This time, the first attendant was with a taller, sterner-looking colleague. The new attendant leaned in, her voice dropping into a more official, no-nonsense tone. "Mr. Thorne, I'm afraid we really need you to relocate. It's important to our operations today." Operations. Such a big, impersonal word. Magnus felt a spark of irritation. "Important to your operations?" he repeated calmly. "Or important to him?" As if on cue, the young man decided it was time to step in. He sauntered over, that smirk still playing on his lips. "Listen, man," he said, as if they were buddies. "I fly with this airline every week. Seat 2A is my spot. It's nothing personal." And in that moment, Magnus found a core of steel within his calm. He looked the young man directly in the eyes. His voice was low, but it carried. Every passenger in the first-class cabin was listening now. "You're right," Magnus said. "It's nothing personal for you, but for the person being asked to give up what they paid for, just because someone else wants it, it feels pretty personal." The young man's smirk vanished. He looked stunned, then annoyed. He wasn't used to being challenged. The taller flight attendant jumped back in, her patience clearly wearing thin. "Gentlemen, please. We can resolve this without..." "Without what?" The silver-haired woman across the aisle cut her off, her voice clear and strong. "Without making a scene? This is a scene, and he's not the one making it." A man in the second row chimed in. "The ticket decides the seat. End of story." The crew was flustered. They hadn't expected a mutiny. They exchanged a worried glance. The taller attendant's voice took on a hard edge. "Sir, if you don't cooperate, we may have to delay this flight." It was a threat, a public one. They were trying to make him the villain, to make him responsible for the inconvenience of everyone else. He could feel the eyes on him, some sympathetic, some annoyed. The pressure was immense. Magnus leaned back in his seat. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't get angry. He just made himself calm, a rock in the middle of a stormy sea. "If that's what it takes," he said, his gaze steady on the attendant, "then I guess we're delaying. I'm not moving." A quiet murmur rippled through the cabin. The standoff had reached its peak. And then a new player arrived, a man in a different uniform, a ground supervisor. His face was a mask of fake pleasantness. He stopped in the aisle, and in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, he delivered the final blow. "Mr. Thorne," he announced, making sure the whole cabin was his audience, "we're going to have to ask you one last time to move to another seat so we can accommodate our elite member. Refusing to comply with crew instructions can result in your removal from this aircraft." Removal. The word hung in the air, heavy and shocking. This was it. They had called his bluff in the most public way possible. They were trying to shame him into submission. Magnus felt a heat rise in his chest, not the heat of embarrassment, but the heat of righteous anger. He set his jaw. He leaned forward slightly, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "So, let me get this straight," he said, looking the supervisor dead in the eye. "You're offering to remove me from my paid seat, to have a conversation about why I should give it to someone else. Is that right?" The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop. The supervisor's mask of pleasantness cracked. He had no answer. The logic of his position was completely absurd, and Magnus had just laid it bare for everyone to see. The supervisor's shoulders slumped slightly. The fight went out of him. He knew he'd lost. "Very well," he said, the words clipped and cold. "Stay in your seat." He turned and walked away, the two flight attendants scurrying after him. The young VIP looked furious, shoving his hands in his pockets and retreating to the back of the cabin. The plane eventually pushed back. It took off. But the peace Magnus had longed for was gone. As the city of Chicago fell away beneath the clouds, he stared out the window, but he wasn't seeing the view. He was replaying it all. The initial request, the smirk, the public threat, the feeling of being just disposable, a man to be moved out of the way for someone deemed more valuable. It was a feeling he knew. He'd felt it in boardrooms and early in his career, when people dismissed the quiet man in the corner before they learned he was the one holding the pen. that would sign the contract. He had always swallowed it, shrugged it off as the cost of doing business. But this time was different. This was a small, personal space, a sanctuary he had paid for, and they had tried to take it with such casual disrespect. The plane touched down in Seattle. The sunset over the Puget Sound was beautiful, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. But Magnus didn't see the beauty. He felt a cold, hard knot in his chest. He collected his bag and walked off the plane. The young VIP brushed past him, not making eye contact. The silver-haired woman gave him one last knowing nod. He walked through the terminal, the noise a dull roar in his ears. His driver was waiting, a cheerful man who always asked about his flight. "Rough day, Mr. Thorne?" he asked. Magnus just slid into the backseat of the car. He looked out the window at the glowing city, the place he had built his company, his life. "We made it," he said quietly. But as the car pulled away from the curb, a different thought was forming in his mind. A thought that was no longer about a single seat on a single flight. It was a thought that began with two simple words. What if? That night, in the quiet of his modern Seattle home overlooking the dark, shimmering water of the bay, Magnus Thorne sat at his kitchen island. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was heavy. The kind of silence that amplifies every thought, every echo of a memory you wish you could forget. He replayed it over and over. The flight attendant's strained smile, the young man's smirk, the supervisor's voice, loud and clear, trying to shame him in front of a plane load of people. He felt the heat of that public spotlight all over again. But mixed with the embarrassment was something else, something colder and harder. A sense of profound injustice. This wasn't the first time he'd been made to feel small. In the early days, when he was just a guy with a laptop and a big idea, he'd been overlooked at conferences, mistaken for an assistant, talked over in meetings. He'd always told himself to be the bigger person, to let it go, to focus on the work, because the work would speak for itself. And it had. His company, Ether Solutions, was a quiet giant. They didn't make flashy consumer apps. They built the invisible, beating heart that kept massive corporations running. And one of those corporations was Global Skyways. The irony was so sharp it almost hurt. He thought about the thousands of flights Global Skyways operated every day. The intricate dance of planes, crew, and maintenance. The entire system, the one that allowed a smirking VIP to believe the world revolved around him, ran on software his team had built. His code, his vision. The cold knot in his chest began to untwist, not into relaxation, but into resolve. It solidified into a single, clear thought. Never again. He picked up his phone. It was late, but he knew his chief operating officer, David Chen, would still be at his desk, wrapping up the details from the Denver deal. David answered on the second ring. "Magnus, everything okay? You should be celebrating." "The deal is fine, David," Magnus said, his voice calm but with a new, steely undertone. "I need you to pull up every contract, every service-level agreement, every line of code we have that touches Global Skyways." There was a pause on the other end of the line. David was a brilliant, pragmatic man, not given to emotional reactions. "Global Skyways? Why? The renewal isn't for months." "I'll explain tomorrow," Magnus said, his eyes fixed on the city lights. "Just have it all ready. I want to know exactly what they rely on us for. Everything." He hung up. The decision was made. This wasn't going to be a loud, angry outburst. That wasn't his style. This would be quiet, precise, devastating. The next morning, the Ether Solutions headquarters buzzed with its usual energy. The floor-to-ceiling windows of the conference room offered a stunning, sun-drenched view of the Seattle skyline. Magnus stood at the head of the polished table, David and a few key senior managers seated around him. "Pull everything," Magnus said, his voice even. "I want the full scope. Terms, renewal dates, response time commitments, everything." David, ever the pragmatist, finally had to ask, "Magnus, what's this about? Did something happen?" Magnus took a slow breath. He didn't tell them about the smirk or the public humiliation. He kept it simple. "On my flight home yesterday, Global Skyways attempted to remove me from a seat I had paid for and confirmed. to give it to another passenger they considered more important. They threatened to have me thrown off the plane when I declined. A stunned silence filled the room. They all knew Magnus. He was their leader, the brilliant, quiet force behind their success. To hear he'd been treated like that, it was jarring. "So, this is about revenge?" one manager tentatively asked. Magnus shook his head. A faint, cold smile touched his lips. "No, this is about respect, and it's about business. They made a decision based on a flawed hierarchy of human value. I'm making a decision based on a clear hierarchy of business value. We are going to reprioritize our clients." He laid out the plan. It was surgical. "We will fulfill our contract with Global Skyways to the absolute letter. Nothing more. No more above and beyond support. No more fast-tracking their emergency tickets. Their requests go to the bottom of the pile." He then turned to David. "And we are going to accelerate talks with Ocean Air, Summit Airlines, and National Express. I want proposals on their desks by the end of the week. Let's see how Global Skyways enjoys being the one who gets moved to the back of the line." It was a masterstroke. It wasn't an emotional tantrum. It was a strategic pivot. They were simply shifting their invaluable resources to clients who valued them more. The message was clear. If you treat us as disposable, we will return the favor. The team got to work. There was a new, determined energy in the office. This wasn't just about a boss being wronged. It was a principle they all believed in. The calls were made. The emails were sent. The gears of corporate consequence began to turn, silently and efficiently. The first signs of trouble for Global Skyways were subtle. 3 days later, a regional operations manager in Houston noticed the scheduling software was running slower. Just a few seconds of lag. Annoying but not critical. Then, a maintenance crew in Frankfurt had a query about a minor part discrepancy. They filed a support ticket, a ticket that, in the past, would have been resolved in an hour. It sat there, and sat there. A week in, the delays began. A flight in Denver was held up for 45 minutes because the crew scheduling system couldn't reconcile a last-minute change. Another in Miami was canceled outright when the maintenance tracking system failed to flag a required inspection on time. Confusion in the regional offices turned to concern. Concern turned to a low-grade panic as reports trickled up to corporate headquarters. Something was wrong with the nervous system of their entire operation. The call came to Magnus's office 2 weeks after the fateful flight. David put it on speakerphone. It was the director of operations for Global Skyways, a man named Robert Hill. His voice was trying to sound calm and professional, but there was a thin wire of strain running through it. "Magnus, Robert Hill here. We've noticed a bit of a shift in the service level we're receiving from your team. Is there something we should be aware of? A problem we need to address?" Magnus leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He was calm. He was in control. "Your service level, Robert, is exactly what our contract specifies. Nothing more, nothing less." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. They could almost hear the man sweating. "We'd like to arrange a meeting to discuss an early renewal. We're prepared to make some adjustments to the terms. We value this partnership." The word value hung in the air, empty and hollow. "I appreciate the offer, Robert," Magnus said, his voice polite but icy. "But I'm already in deep discussions with Ocean Air and Summit. We'll fulfill our current agreement with you, of course. But beyond that, I believe our priorities are now better aligned elsewhere." The silence from the other end was deafening. The message had been received. The power had not just shifted, it had been inverted. The airline that had tried to push a man out of his seat was now being gently, firmly shown the door. Weeks later, a thick cream-colored envelope arrived by courier. It was from the office of the CEO of Global Skyways. Magnus opened it. The letter was full of corporate language, but the essence was an apology. It expressed deep regret for any misunderstanding on one of their flights and a sincere hope to rebuild our strong business relationship. Magnus read it once. Then he set it down on his desk. It was an apology, yes, but it was an apology that had been forced out of them by delayed flights and angry customers. It was an apology born of consequence, not of contrition. It meant nothing. He never replied. That evening he had dinner with an old friend who had heard whispers of the story. So you're really not going back? His friend asked. Magnus swirled the wine in his glass, thoughtful. Not unless they buy a ticket, he said softly, to my flight, seat 2A. The moral of this story isn't about revenge, it's about respect. Respect isn't about your job title, the size of your bank account, or how often you fly. It's about how you treat another human being when you think no one is watching, and it doesn't cost you anything to be kind. The smallest choices can have the largest costs. A moment of arrogance on an airplane can ripple out, causing delays, losing millions of dollars, and severing a vital partnership. The price of that seat turned out to be far higher than anyone could have imagined. So if you've ever been in Magnus's shoes, overlooked, pushed aside, made to feel small, remember this story. Remember that you have a power you may not even know you possess. The power to say no, the power to stand your ground with quiet dignity, the power to decide your own worth. Because sometimes the quietest person in the room, in the cabin, in the seat, can make the loudest statement of all.